We're going to have our reading now, and Ben is going to bring that reading. We're starting into the book of Habakkuk this morning, and Ben is going to read chapter 1 and the first 4 verses to us. Ben.
The reading is taken from Habakkuk chapter 1, beginning at the first verse. The prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received, Habakkuk's complaint. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. This ends the reading.
So I want to say thanks to Ben for reading those verses to us this morning. I am excited about starting this book, and I think it's very relevant to the day that you and I live in. Suppose we could give it the title, Why God, Why? Who could ever have imagined a year ago that our whole world was going to be stretched, shaken, shattered, closed down by something called coronavirus? And in times of crisis, people pray more. I have prayed more than I've ever prayed. A study by an associate professor in economics of the University of Copenhagen states that Google searches for the word prayer has surged and skyrocketed since last March. People are wondering. People are questioning and searching. Does prayer work? Will God listen? Can prayer change things? These are questions we all battle with as we bring our fears and our worries, our anxieties, our struggles to God in prayer. That's why I think that these studies in this little book called Habakkuk, written around 600 BC, are so very relevant for us in our world right now. Habakkuk is a prophet, and a prophet is usually someone who speaks God's message to people. But Habakkuk never really does that. The whole book is more a two-way conversation between Habakkuk and God, a prayer, a complaint to God. All around Habakkuk and Jerusalem, where he lives, he sees a society who were called God's people, but who are drifting further and further away from God and God's ways. He sees a society that is increasingly corrupt, lawless, violent, where all kinds of injustice and bribery, corruption, fighting was going on. And that not only breaks God's laws and God's heart, it's also breaking Habakkuk's heart as well. Like us in Northern Ireland, we look at how much things have changed over these last number of years rapidly. Things in society, morally, spiritually, ethically, in these last 50 years, even in these last 10 years. It's unthinkable, unbelievable how much our society has even thrown God's ways and turned away from God's guidance in these last few years. But as we pick up these opening verses in Habakkuk chapter 1, you get a sense that he has been praying and asking God to change and transform the people's hearts and lives and ways. And yet instead of things getting better, it seems that things are getting worse. So you can almost hear the frustration, the desperation in Habakkuk's opening prayer in verses 1 to 4. How long, Lord, is this going on? Why, God? Why aren't you answering our prayers? Why are all these things happening in our world? Why don't you do something to stop it, to help us, to change things? I love the way that Habakkuk voices our bewilderment today. He articulates our confusion. He verbalizes our disappointments in God when it feels like he hasn't answered our prayers. Let me ask you, do you ever wonder what God is doing or not doing in our world right now? Why God hasn't answered your prayers or even responded to your pain? How long will we have to go through this terrible time and these horrendous sufferings? Like you, like us, Habakkuk is really struggling with God. He's struggling with prayer. He's struggling to see any sign of God at work in the chaos and the brokenness of his city, Jerusalem. And so verses 1 to 5 are really Habakkuk's prayer to God, his complaints to God. He cries to God. And the whole book is about how Habakkuk comes to see and believe that despite the trouble and the hardships that breaks his heart, that God is still in control, even when things around him seem way out of control. And that God is working and will answer his prayers, but not in the ways that Habakkuk expects in his wildest dreams. I mean, many followers of Jesus right around the world have been praying for revival for many, many years. We've been doing that in this place. But revival, I mean hundreds, if not thousands of people coming back to God, beginning to follow Jesus with everything they've got. Well, imagine who would believe it, conceive it, imagine it. Yet, as I said at the start, that in this past year, Google search has gone crazy on this word prayer. Faced with the catastrophic things that it is, the coronavirus pandemic, huge numbers of people who would normally not have thought too much about God and prayer are asking questions of spiritual meaning for their lives. Holy Trinity Brompton is the home of the Alpha course and the Alpha film series. The course which allows people to have conversations about faith, about God, about the meaning of life, about prayer. They usually have 300 to 400 at their course in the church building. They've begun new online courses and have had 1,000 people register, sign up for those courses, who indeed can take part safely in their own homes. And we here in St. Paul's are launching our first ever online Alpha course in 3 weeks' time. And you'll see more info about that on our Facebook page. But the point is that people who are way too busy and too distracted before all this present crisis are being jolted out of their complacency by this horror and the fear of this pandemic, and are now beginning to ask some of the most important questions of life. These are amazing moments for our world and for our church. So let's look now at this little book and open our hearts and minds and souls to anything and everything that God might be saying to you in these moments. Habakkuk, his name means embrace, grasp. This is the story of one man's struggle to embrace what God is doing in his generation. One man who is wrestling with God, wrestling in prayer, wrestling to make sense of the brokenness of his society and his city. We read verse 1, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. The word oracle means here burden or weight. He has a heavy heart, a real sadness in his heart. He is brokenhearted when he looks around at his society and the church of his day, and he sees how people are living their lives. He sees how they are hurting and fighting and lying and deceiving and treating one another. And look at the words he uses to describe life in Jerusalem in verses 1 to 4. 2 times the word he uses, violence, in verses 2 and 3. The word iniquity in verse 3. The word destruction, strife, fighting, verse 3. Injustice, broken law courts, bribery in verse 4. Those who are trying to live upright lives are being attacked, hounded, surrounded by the wicked, verse 4. I don't think that his society is far removed from society as we know it around us today in Northern Ireland or Great Britain. So the question, would you agree? And Habakkuk is obviously distressed and distraught by all of this, heavy-hearted, broken-hearted, because people are broken and wounded and hurting. I love those words in Matthew chapter 9 describing Jesus' heart when he saw crowds of people around him. And it says this, that Jesus felt great compassion for the crowds that came because their problems were so great and they didn't know where to go for help. They were like sheep without a shepherd. That's exactly describing how Habakkuk feels as he looks at the people in his city and in his day. He's been crying out to God for years, something maybe for like 20 years, he's been crying out to God in prayer to do something, to change things, to help people, and yet it feels to Habakkuk like God isn't answering his prayers. In verse 2, he says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen?" So here's the question. Tell me this. What prayers have you been praying to God for ages and still don't see any answers? Who have you been crying out to God for to change? What situations have you prayed and prayed and prayed over and still see no difference? For all your prayers, for all your tears, for all your burdens, you've not seen God do anything yet. Maybe you just don't understand God and his ways. Maybe like Habakkuk, you're frustrated with God. So his two prayers: one, how long, God, before I see a breakthrough? Two, why, God, do you allow all this pain to go on in this city and do nothing? It's really discouraging and heartbreaking when you've prayed and asked and prayed and asked God about something or someone, and instead of things getting better, it feels like they're only getting worse. It's really difficult when you've prayed and prayed, and you know in your heart and you have believed in your soul that God can do anything, that God can do something, that God can change any situation, but for whatever reason, he's not changing yours. How long, Lord, do I have to pray before I see a breakthrough? Why do you allow sin and evil and wickedness to prosper and good people to suffer? Why, God? Why? Do you know what I love about Habakkuk's prayer here in this opening blast against God? He doesn't pray nice prayers to God. Do you know what I mean by nice prayers? He just says from his heart what he's feeling and what is real. He talks to God. And that is important, because prayer is simply conversation with God. You open your heart and your soul to God. You tell him what you're really feeling, as Habakkuk is doing here. Tell him what your struggles and your frustrations are. Be real with God about your upsets, your disappointments, where you feel he has let you down or maybe failed you. Don't hide what you're really struggling with inside. Tell God what you are feeling in prayer, because that is important. But also be prepared. God might just answer your prayers. God might just answer your prayers in ways that you would never expect in your wildest dreams. So some questions. Are you willing and prepared to let God be God of this world and of your life? Are you willing to trust God with what he knows and what he is doing in your circumstances? Even though it might surprise you or even shock you at first, that's the risk you need to take if you want a two-way conversation with God. Because God is bigger than you think. God sees things in ways that you and I don't or can't. God really is in charge of this world, our society, your family, and if you let him, your life. And through the good things and the bad things, through the terrible things and the toughest things, like this coronavirus, the Apostle Paul would say to us in Romans, and let me read these words, Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purposes. All things, the good things, the bad things, the worst things, the coronavirus things. Maybe as we start this book of Habakkuk, you can identify with him and say, I'm with you, Habakkuk. I'm confused. I'm bewildered. I don't understand God and his ways or what he's doing in my world today. I've got as many questions and fears and doubts as you, Habakkuk. And by the end of the book, we'll see that Habakkuk comes to really trust God, even if everything is stripped down and taken away from his life, even when things are still very dark and difficult, even when life doesn't make sense, even when there are no easy answers. We have a good Father. Folks, I want to tell you, we really do have a loving Heavenly Father. And we believe, like the Apostle Paul and Habakkuk too. Listen to these words that Paul also has spoken. Who could ever separate us from the endless love of Christ? Absolutely no one. For nothing in the universe has the power to diminish his love towards us. Troubles, pressures, and problems are unable to come between us and heaven's love. What about persecution, deprivation, dangers, and death threats? No, for they can't hinder God's omnipotent love, even though it is written, all day long we face death threats for your sake, God. We are considered to be nothing more than sheep to be slaughtered. Yet even in the midst of all these things, we triumph over them all. For God has made us to be more than conquerors, and his demonstrated love is our glorious victory over everything. So now I live with the confidence that there is nothing in the universe with the power to separate us from God's love. And Paul goes on to say, I'm convinced that his love will triumph over death, life's troubles, fallen angels, or dark rulers in heaven. There is nothing in our present or future circumstances that can weaken his love. There is no power above us or beneath us, no power that could ever be found in the universe that can distance us from God's passionate love, which is lavished upon us through our Lord Jesus Christ. Folks, what a confidence, what a conviction in those words. When everything in the world is shaken and uncertain for you and me, we have this one unshakable certainty in Jesus that we are loved by God, and nothing that happens to us in this world is going to shake or break us away from God's love. We'll see more of that as we journey through this book of Habakkuk in the coming weeks. But I really pray this morning that that's been a help to you, just to be real, to be honest, to be open with God, as we see this prophet Habakkuk was, and how he just poured out of his life all those things that disturbed him, and all those things that he couldn't understand, all his frustrations. And we will see that God is a good Father, and that God indeed will, by the end of this book, answer Habakkuk's prayers. Maybe not in the way that he anticipates or expects, but God's ways are perfect, and God's ways are just, and God's ways are right. Listen to this lovely song. You're a good Father.